Welcome to the RSP Film and Theory. Adam Harstad and Matt Waldman. We're joining today. We're going to talk a little bit about, maybe how we approach the concept of age incorrectly in fantasy football, and do our dented cans episode for the year. Talk a little bit about some players that maybe we think in the coming year might have a chance to rebound and might be worth buying low on them. So, Adam, why don't we start off with age? I know we've discussed this before, but I think it's worth going over. And you've written about this a number of times, but I think you continue to find something new or another way of looking at it that might be helpful for folks, especially in dynasty formats.
I don't know if it's a new way of looking at it. I just think it's useful to have the reminders, and every season has its own reminders. So I got in fantasy football. I got into dynasty leagues in 2007 was my first year. And at the time, the approach to age was you just didn't think about it. I remember the first overall pick in my startup draft was LaDainian Tomlinson, who was 29 or 30 at the time. And granted, he was coming off of the greatest fantasy season by a running back since 1975 O.J. Simpson. But like today, that would not have happened. Nobody would take a 29, 30-year-old running back as the 1.01 in a dynasty startup, no matter how good he was. My second dynasty startup was in 2013, and Adrian Peterson was coming off of a similar type season, and he fell to the end of the first round. And so, people didn't really think of age. And I mean, there were just some wild examples. Sean Alexander was 30 and coming off of a down year, and he was a second round pick in the startup, which would just never happen. And that ended badly for a lot of people. And then people started thinking like, hey, maybe we should actually pay attention to how old the players are that we're drafting for our dynasty teams. And so there's some talk about like, how do we value players? And so the first approach was they would just take production by age and average it all together and see what it looked like, and it produces a curve. And this is known as the age curve. And there's lots of different ways to go about creating this curve. The easiest way is you can just say like, how many fantasy points do running backs average at 24? How much do they average at 25? How much do they average at 26? And so on. And that'll produce like a nice bell curve. They enter the league, they improve, they improve, they improve. They hit their peak, they decline, they decline, they decline. They're out of the league. But there's other ways that can also replicate this curve. Chase Stewart once did one where it was like, let's look at the percentage improvement or decline from year to year and average those together. And okay, at from age 24 to 25, running backs typically improve by 10%. From age 27 to 28, they typically decline by 12% or whatever, and you average it all together and you graph that, and that also creates a curve. You can look at all of the 250-point fantasy seasons in history and plot those by age. And, there's like 3 times as many of those seasons at age 25 as there were at age 29. That also produces a nice curve. So people, that became like the conventional wisdom that like, this is how players age. They enter the league, they improve, they improve, they improve. They hit their peak, they kind of hang out at their peak for a bit. They decline, they decline, they decline. They're out of the league. Nice smooth curves. And it had the advantage of being better than what we used to be doing, which was just ignoring age entirely. But it has the disadvantage of being completely false. That's not at all what player careers look like. If you actually look at a player career, it's extraordinarily rare for any player to follow that pattern. That's not what it looks like. Instead, typically what happens is that a player comes into the league and they improve for a bit. Usually the improvement phase is pretty quick. Maybe it's a year or two, and then they reach their peak. And then once they've reached their peak, they just kind of fluctuate. They kind of bounce around for a while. Some years they have slightly better years. Some years they have slightly worse years, but they're mostly just fluctuating around a fixed peak until at some point they just completely fall out of relevance. One year they're cruising along, they're a superstar. The next year they're barely replacement level, or they're out of the NFL. And that decline, I always call it the cliff. The cliff is looming for everybody, and the cliff comes. It's not really predictable when the cliff is going to come. You get guys like Des Bryant, who's a first-team All-Pro at 28, and then basically never fantasy relevant ever again after that. You get guys like, people don't think that the cliff can come at 22 or 23, but I can name a lot of receivers who were basically all pros or top 10 fantasy receivers at age 22 or 23
Josh
and
Gordon.
then done. Josh Gordon, David Boston, Marcus Robinson, Jermaine Crowell.
Robinson was fun to watch too. Robinson
Yeah,
and
he
Crowell
was.
were fun to watch.
Who was the Browns guy that they drafted in the top 5 or top 10 who had like 16 touchdowns that one year? Big Browns receiver.
I blocked it out of my mind. Obviously, I don't even remember.
I know, and he was. It'll come to me. I'm sure it'll come to me.
Yeah.
But there's so many examples. We don't really remember
Patrick
them.
Jeffers. Yeah.
Patrick Jeffers, yeah. He had like more yards in his one in like 1999 with Carolina than he had in like all of his other career years combined. Oh, Braylon Edwards.
Oh, Braylon Edwards. That's right, Michigan kid.
Yeah. And he was. I mean, again, you could say, oh, well, these guys are flukes. They're flashes in the pan. Braylon Edwards was the number 3 overall pick. He had 512 yards at age 22. He had 900 yards at age 23. He had 1,300 yards and 16 touchdowns at age 24. Like, it was a second team All-Pro. This is a clear ascent. This guy's on the path to superstar status. He was going to be the next big thing. And then after that, he never topped like 908 yards was his next best season. And
Javon Walker, it's another one like that. Yeah,
Javon Walker, absolutely. There's so many examples, and the problem is that like these examples don't come to mind because they fell off the cliff, and so we don't remember them, and so we think it's much rarer than it actually is. But if you do like a rigorous and methodological analysis of the data, you find that like there's lots of examples of these guys who 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, all of these ages might be the end. Now the cliff becomes more and more common as you get older and older. It's more likely that a 32-year-old receiver is going to be completely done than it is that a 25-year-old receiver is going to be completely done. But the risk is there for everyone. And so the question then becomes, if careers are rarely curve-shaped, why is it that all of these different approaches produce the exact same curve? And it's something called ecological fallacy, that like it's possible for relationships that are true at the population level to not be true at the individual level. And it's just an artifact of the fact that the cliff becomes more common as you get older, so the averages become lower as you get older. If receivers are averaging 50% as much production at age 32, that doesn't mean they're all producing 50% as much. It means half of them are producing the full amount and half of them are producing nothing. That's where the 50% is coming from. So when you look at things, my main criticism of the age curve mindset, again, it's better than what came before, which is that we ignore age entirely, but it kind of posits like a deterministic universe, that things follow this orderly pattern, and we can predict relatively precisely what's going to happen. And it creates this false sense of confidence. Whereas like an age cliff mentality will often make the same predictions. It says, oh yeah, I think the expected value of this guy's production is the same. But whereas age curves will say like, there's 100% chance that this guy gives you 70% of his prime production. An age cliff will say like, there's a 70% chance that this guy gives you his full prime production, no caveats, and there's a 30% chance that he's just toast. And those two different scenarios have different value. They mean different things. They have different amounts of usefulness.
One accounts for that. One says Jerry Rice was going to be done at 33.
Right.
And
yeah, I mean, an age cliff looks at Jerry Rice and says, there's no way that this happened. Like, it just can't. There's no way to explain this. Whereas with age cliffs, it looks at Jerry Rice and it says, well, this was unlikely that Jerry Rice specifically would do this. But it's not really unlikely that a Jerry Rice exists somewhere. If every year there's a chance that you fall off, given enough receivers, you're going to find one who just refuses year after year after year after year to fall off. I compare it to a coin flip. Every receiver flips a coin before the season. If it comes up heads, business as usual. If it comes up tails, sorry, you're done. Like that. I hope you enjoyed your career. It's over now. And the coin gets weighted more and more towards tails as you get older, but it's always possible to flip heads. And however unlikely an individual receiver is to get like 12 heads in a row, at some point, given enough samples, somebody's going to do it. So yeah, age cliffs, they have the advantage of better matching reality in terms of like actual players. Yeah.
I'm just laughing, but I'm thinking about our football guys retreat when who was it? When Cecil and who was it playing rock paper scissors? Do you remember that?
Danny Tucito.
Danny Tucito, and Danny was like and like Cecil seemed to like guess him at every turn, like literally like 10 times in a row, and it was like it was literally like flipping a coin 10 times in a row. That was that way.
I mean, it happens. You get enough people flipping coins. If there was a national coin flipping championship, somebody's going to come out there flipping 20 coins in a row. Individually, that's quite unlikely, but you know, if everybody in the nation is flipping coins, somebody's going to do it. Like, that's a virtual statistical certainty. But so I wrote that in 2015 and I gave the evidence, and like some of the evidence is that like if age curves are true, that predicts certain things, and if age cliffs are true, that predicts certain things. And we can look at the data and say which of those predictions is borne out. So for instance, if age curves are true, we would expect that players tend to perform worse in their last fantasy relevant season than they do in their second to last fantasy relevant season, because this is the decline stage of their career. Like, by definition, they are getting worse each year. If age cliffs are true, we should expect it to be about 50-50. They're just randomly fluctuating around their mean, and random means half the time they're going to be up, half the time they're going to be down, and then they hit the cliff and they're gone. And if you look at the data, that's actually what you see, that 50% of the top fantasy players, fantasy running backs, wide receivers over the last 30, 40 years, were better in their last fantasy season than they were in their second to last fantasy season. They weren't declining. They were, just fluctuating. And this is, I mean, I especially like it this season because this is basically like the season for age cliffs. Like, there's 4 running backs right now averaging 20 PPR fantasy points per game. There's 30-year-old Derrick Henry, who had a down year last year. There's 29-year-old Alvin Kamara, who had a down year last year. There's 27-year-old Saquon Barkley, who had a down year last year. And there's 28-year-old Joe Mixon, who had a down year last year. All 4 of these backs are quote-unquote old, at least for the position. They're past the peak according to the age curve. They are trending down. And so age curves say, well, they were down last year, so they're clearly in the decline portion. They're going to be down even more this year. Whereas age cliffs say they were down last year, but that's just random fluctuation. Sometimes you have a bad year, whether you're 26, 27, 28, or whatever, and they're just as likely, assuming they aren't done as fantasy players, assuming they haven't like hit the cliff, they haven't lost a step they couldn't afford to lose, assuming they're not done, they're just as likely to be up this year as they are to be down again. And that's what we saw. And even further down the list, guys like Tony Pollard, Josh Jacobs, Aaron Jones, DeAndre Swift, there's lots of guys who are up, Najee Harris, who are up at a time when we, like, theoretically, they should not be improving. They should be getting worse every year. And also, there's always older players who we thought were going to be fine and they've fallen off dramatically. That's also always the case. But I just thinking of things as the coin flip, where just because he's old and he was bad last year doesn't mean he's going to be worse this year, opens managers up to take risks that historically have been pretty productive, like drafting guys like Derrick Henry or Joe Mixon or Saquon Barkley at a time where, according to the age curves, maybe the fundamentals are a little bit scary.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I love for me, the takeaway insight is to think of it in terms of they didn't necessarily hit their cliff. They just fluctuated there, and fluctuation accounts for, even if it's not directly, it accounts for offensive line play, quarterback play, bad defenses, situations, all the different contexts that could contribute to a lack of touches or a lack of quality touches that are outside the running back's control or outside a receiver's control.
Or even just, dumb luck. Running back production is just so heavily skewed by those 60, 70, 80-yard runs.
Yeah.
And those are always such rare events that, like, maybe you just get a cold streak for a while where you don't get any of those long runs, and it looks like you're a different player. That looks like, oh, he's less efficient, he's whatever, where it's just, like he didn't get, he rolled snake eyes a couple times. He didn't get hit the jackpot, but we know that he is a back who is prone to hitting the jackpot. Like Derrick Henry, the value proposition of Derrick Henry is not like people thought it was that, like, well, he'll probably get a lot of carries because Baltimore gave him stuff. The value proposition is either he's Derrick Henry, in which case there's a great chance he's a league winner, or he's not Derrick Henry, in which case you probably wasted the pick. But fantasy football, like you're not trying to be fourth place, you're trying to be first of 12. So these like high risk, high reward options tend to be more valuable.
And I like it because even as a guy who scouts players, I've always found that when you kind of eliminate the big runs from the situation and say, what creates big runs? What does a back do within his control to create big runs? Then you can look at the processes that are in place to say, all right, he may not have gotten big runs here. He may not have had opportunities to get big runs here. But is he doing the things necessary on his end to create big runs? And when that happens, that tended to be that's a valuable part of the process, is that you're looking at, what are you doing to put yourself in position to make plays and put your teammates in position to make plays. And that's really kind of the basis for how I scout talent, is looking at all those different things. So a guy like that, I mean, I like how you discuss that, because it really does, it makes sense even from that standpoint, that perspective of analyzing the game. So, okay, well, we talked about a lot of dented cans from last year that we brought up. Najee Harris was one. I believe we brought up Derrick Henry. I'm pretty sure that you brought up Alvin Kamara last year as well. So we had a lot of guys like that. Who are some guys that you feel like this year? And I'll just say, by the way, in terms of, it's very rare to have big plays. If we go to wide receiver, I would say that's all true unless you're Jamar Chase.
The numbers quick diversion, like the numbers on that are pretty nuts. Like if you look at, everybody thinks of Tyreek Hill as the best big play in the league, and like one of the best big plays of all time, absolutely no question. But even compared to like Tyreek Hill, if you look at like 60-yard touchdowns through X games, if you look at like the most 60-yard touchdowns since he entered the league, like Jamar Chase has the most 60-yard touchdowns of the last 5 years, and he's only been in the league for 3 of them. It's like you look at the historical context, and it's like Jamar Chase and Lance Allworth kind of stuff. And it's different because, I mean, he's getting more of his yards on the ground than through the air. Tyreek Hill, like he's probably targeted further downfield on his big plays. Although I'm not saying Jamar Chase is a slouch as a deep threat too, but like he's more dangerous with the ball in his hands. I think Jamar Chase, AJ Brown, probably the two most dangerous. Oh, and Deebo Samuel, depending on Deebo Samuel's like almost not a receiver. He's kind of something unique to himself. But those guys, I think, are more likely to leg out a 60-yarder out of a 5-yarder. But just the rate at which he's hitting the big plays. And you have to at some point say that normally these are unsustainable plays, but like at this point it's demonstrated skill. This is part of his value proposition. It's part of his game. Like you don't really expect Jamar Chase. You expect everybody to regress to the mean, but the mean that Jamar Chase is regressing to is not the mean that everybody else is regressing to. He's going to be getting a lot of those big plays over the next 2-3 years, and that's a lot of the value that he brings.
Yeah, if it were up to me, I mean, like I can't get my hands on Jamar Chase in pretty much any league. I've tried multiple times. But I'm at the point now that I almost feel like if I want to play in a league with people and say, listen, I'll make a deal with you. I get Jamar Chase, and we can somehow split up the second and third round picks. I'll give them up. I'll give up my second and third round pick for like the next 2 years. Just give me Jamar Chase. I'll play in a league like that just to see how it turns out and see if I can work my way around it.
Would he be your pick for best receiver in the league right now? Or?
Absolutely.
Interesting.
I wrote about this on Monday and said him and Justin Jefferson are 1-2, and I for me, but I think when you look at Jamar Chase, for the exact reasons you stated, he is the most dangerous player after the catch due to his size and speed, his strength, and his ability to make people miss and just outmotor people. I mean, the way he accelerates past people who have angles on him in the secondary is impressive. And then on top of it, I think he is just as good of a route runner as Justin Jefferson, maybe even a little better. And he can, and like Jefferson, he's tough over the middle. He's tough at the contested catch areas, and he can play all three positions extremely well. So he's basically just a bigger, stronger, faster player in the same tier as Justin Jefferson. And and to me, he has one of the 3 to 4 best quarterbacks in the league on top of it.
Yeah, it's funny. I think we've kind of flipped on this. Like a year to 2 years ago, I was on, like, I think that Jamar Chase might be the best receiver in the NFL. And I've, like Justin Jefferson has kind of worn me down. And I'm like, all right, no, I mean, I want it to not be Jefferson, not because I have anything against Jefferson, but just from an aesthetic standpoint, I want it to not be Jefferson. But now I'm kind of at the point where I'm like, I just can't, like, it has to be Jefferson. And it's funny because I feel like you've gone the other way where I feel like a year or two ago you might have preferred Jefferson, and now you're on like, no, I think Chase is the better receiver.
Honestly, I've always had Chase.
Okay.
It was really between Chase. It was kind of between guys like Chase, Devontae, and Tyreek Hill. But I was always kind of being open to the idea of like, yeah, and Jefferson in there too, for sure. But like, yeah, I'm not going to argue with anybody about any of those other players, but I'm starting to lean to the point that I almost want to argue with people about how much I like Chase more, but it's still close enough with Jefferson that I can't fault anybody for feeling that way.
I always want it to be AJ Brown. And I don't think it's unreasonable if somebody says like AJ Brown is my pick for the best receiver in the NFL. Like, I think that should be within the Overton window. I don't think he's the best. I think he's the number 3. I don't really see the argument for him over Chase and Jefferson, but I very much want to see the argument for him over Chase and Jefferson, just because, like, he plays angry, and that's kind of appealing to me.
He's T.O. with better hands.
Or Anquan Bolden. Yeah,
yes.
Like he's the new, he's like a slightly faster Anquan Bolden. And I love to, part of the reason Jefferson won me over was seeing him excel with different quarterbacks. I mean, it's always hard to separate a player from their context and say how much is the player and how much is the context. And so whenever that separation occurs, and I can be like, oh, okay, yeah, no, I'm much more confident that this is, not that I doubted that it was Jefferson, but seeing it and believing it are very different things. Yeah. And I just love AJ Brown because he's like such an obvious force multiplier on offense. Like both what he did in Tennessee, and then he leaves and Tennessee falls off, and he joins Philly and Philly goes through the roof. And then even in Philly, you can see such a difference in the games with Brown in and Brown out that extends far beyond his production, which obviously is unimpeachable in and of itself. And then like stylistically, aesthetically, that's kind of my, I'm one of the guys who T.O. is on my Rushmore. I might take T.O. over Randy Moss, just because, again, it's that same force multiplier. We saw T.O. go to like 8 different teams, and yes, we can have a conversation about why he went to those 8 different teams, and that's a part of T.O.'s legacy. But at the same time, like, there's no denying that if you were an offense and you added T.O., you just got 50% better. Whether you were a good offense to begin with, whether you were a bad offense to begin with, the guy was just a force multiplier.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, listen, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, 3 of the favorite receivers I've ever evaluated, for sure. They're fantastic players for all the reasons you mentioned. I just love the fact that all 3 of them can play all 3 positions. All 3 of them can win contested plays. All 3 of them are tough over the middle. All 3 of them can run through you or run around you. And they're all savvy in their different ways as route runners. I think that Chase is the most technically crisp of all of them, and he makes it all look easy. So he makes some very difficult things look easy in terms of tracking the football, whereas Justin Jefferson is pretty close in all of those ways. I would say that those 2 are the better route runners than A.J. Brown, but the fact that A.J. Brown is that big and can move that well and run routes as well as he does and play all three positions. Like, I mean, he was a slot receiver at Ole Miss, and they started him in the slot in Tennessee. And then you move him, and they didn't think you could move from. I don't know why people thought this, but you couldn't move him to X or flanker, and you're seeing that. I mean, he's everything that DK Metcalf people wanted DK Metcalf to be and more. And I mean, like, I like DK, but he's more in the bottom end of the top 15 than he is in terms of just like overall skill and potential there. But yeah, those three guys are fantastic. So let's go back to some dented cans and we'll wrap this up. But who are some guys this year? Like, I wonder. I think last year I mentioned Trevor Lawrence as a dented can, and I feel like he's still dented. But I'm wondering if you're ever going to be able to pop out the dents on that one just because of the situation he's in. But I'm still thinking he's got a long career path likely ahead of him. So I'm still kind of bullish on buying low on someone like him.
Yeah, Lawrence is hard. Not because the eval on Lawrence himself, but just the nature of the position for fantasy, where like if you are in a one quarterback league, you're either a top 6 quarterback or you basically don't have fantasy value. You're not providing, if you're the number 8, number 10, number 12 quarterback, it's not really improving your bottom line. And I agree with you that Trevor Lawrence, to me, seems like a quarterback who has the skill to cut it in the league, but also he seems like a quarterback where, like, I don't really see that path to top 6. Not even just Jacksonville. Anybody, and I don't want to foreclose the possibility. Carson Palmer for the longest time was like my punching bag for, like, this is like the Eli Manning line. Like, the guy is right. Like, you're going to put him in there and he's going to be fine, but he's not going to elevate. He's like a roster albatross in fantasy. Like, he's never going to be the guy. And then he went to Arizona, and in 2015 had that like insane season where you look at like the top 8 receivers in first down percentage at their position, and it's all Arizona Cardinals, where like all he was doing was throwing past the sticks and completing it and getting first downs, and just like this monster season. So I always say, people talk about like, what's this player's ceiling? And I'm like, you need to remember, in 1999, a 28-year-old grocery store bag boy started his first NFL game and went on to become the league MVP.
Right.
Every player's ceiling is league MVP, smashing records. I mean, not really, but like as far as we know, for what we know about the players and their potential, every player's ceiling, if you're looking at like 99.9th percentile outcomes, is Hall of Famer NFL records. But so, like, I don't want people coming back 5 years from now and being like, oh, look, Trevor Lawrence was the number 3 fantasy quarterback this year. Eat your crow. And that's a possibility. I just think it's a less realistic possibility for Lawrence than some of the more uncertain quarterbacks, like, let's say, Drake May or Bo Nix, where I think there's a bit more uncertainty in their range of outcomes. Lawrence is probably a better quarterback than them 90 times out of 100, 80 times out of 100. But because of that uncertainty, maybe those are the guys I'd like to gamble on. So yeah, Trevor Lawrence, I think, still a dented can, but he's just, I don't think the payoff is there.
I've got one that might be, if I'll share one more. Yeah. And there'll be no crow eating today. But I will say Jalen Waddle, to me, is a clear dented can this year. I mean, 3 years of at least 1,000 yards. He had a 1,300-yard season 2 years ago, and now he's at 367 yards. Played all 9 games. He's played 9 games thus far. 57th overall, or in the 60s, depending on PPR, non-PPR type of format. But certainly someone that I don't think there's anything changed with him in terms of like what he's capable of doing.
Yeah, and it's, Waddle kind of had like the weirdest first season, second season splits ever. Like, his first season, he was a productive fantasy player in like the Brian Hartline role. Like, he's just like this stupid dink and dunk Danny Amendola, where they're like, well, we'll just like dump it off to Waddle and let him try to do something after the catch. And maybe that was Miami's best option, because it's not like they had a lot of other great options at the time. And then the next year, He's again like a top fantasy producer, but he's like averaging like 19 yards a catch. Like all they're
Yeah.
doing is throwing, let's throw deep balls to Waddle, and it just kind of
He
shows the
nearly
breadth of his
doubled
skill
his
set.
yard per reception in
Right,
the next year. Yeah.
which doesn't happen. Not at volume. It just doesn't happen. It's you don't see a guy go from like Wes Welker to Randy Moss in role from year one to year two. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But I like that. I think it demonstrates like a breadth of skills that I think gives him like some value insulation. That no matter where he winds up, things change fast in the NFL. I like to do this one a lot where I'm like, all right, who are your top 20 dynasty receivers? Now, do an honest look at what their situation looks like today and what their situation looked like 2 years ago. And Drake London obviously is the most salient example where like a year ago he's catching passes from Desmond Ridder. Today he's catching passes from Kirk Cousins. Things change fast, but London is not the exception there.
Hey, look, Desmond Ridder was starting 2 days ago, and then yesterday he was not, and they didn't even have a game.
Yep. I mean, yeah, Justin Jefferson came into the NFL. Philly passed on him because they're like, oh, he's just a slot receiver. We don't think he can play outside.
Yeah.
He was the number 3 behind Diggs and Thielen. Like he's, I guess Diggs had just left, but he's stuck behind Adam Thielen, and like when Justin Jefferson comes into the NFL, you're like, oh, this is a terrible situation for him. AJ Brown was tied to the most run-heavy offense with Marcus Mariota at quarterback. And by the end of his first year, they're like the most explosive passing game with Ryan Tannehill at quarterback, which Tannehill himself was like, who Tannehill? Like he was a bust. He was a retread. So things change fast. And so you want the guys who have skill sets that can adapt to a lot of different circumstances so that they can take advantage of wherever things change. And I like Waddle. I think Waddle is one of those guys. I don't think he's not as good as Jamar Chase. I'm not going to be ruffling any feathers with that one.
But he fits kind of in the Chris Godwin archetype in the way you described it. Now, Godwin, maybe not. Godwin's more physical and not as fast, whereas Waddle can be that top, take the top end off the defense. But they both have that versatility to play inside, outside, and like you said, adaptable as a result of that.
I don't know if this is controversial, but I think Jalen Waddle is a better receiver than DK Metcalf. I don't know if that is or should be. I don't think it's like a slam dunk. I like DK Metcalf. I like Jalen Waddle. But if I'm picking a receiver to start a team today, I probably pick Waddle over Metcalf. I think they're kind of in the same range, but to me, I would prefer Waddle.
I would too, as a football team for sure.
Yeah.
So how about you? Anybody come to mind as a dented can?
Yeah, Kyler Murray was one of mine for a while. And I love the Call of Duty narrative. I'm like, yeah, go ahead and talk that shit all you want. Like, you don't get to be where Kyler Murray is without being devoted to the game. It doesn't happen.
Right.
People talk about, game's going to come out and he's not going to be doing the game plans. Like, if the guy wasn't putting in the work, he wouldn't be as successful as he was to that point. Again, people think that careers are like these orderly arcs, and they're like, oh, well, Kyler Murray didn't improve from year 2 to year 3 or whatever. So like he's done improving, like he's now capped out. And that's just not how it works. So I really liked Kyler Murray. That can's probably, like back to full price at this point based on how hot he started. And most importantly, like how good he's looked while starting that hot.
I will say this. That'll be one I'll disagree with you on.
Okay.
Because but that's okay. I mean, we'll have fun seeing how it plays out. And part of it is that I just can't stand Kyler Murray. I don't know what it is. I mean, like, it's not the Call of Duty thing necessarily. It's seeing him blame other people who are like far more experienced than he was for things, and watching him play. He's kind of like a James Harden black hole type of player who I don't see him supporting. He supports so much as a runner. But he's supported really like 2 fantasy worthy starters in his career when you look at it, and he's not been able to support multiple. Now maybe that has to do with his offense, maybe that has to do with things outside of his control, but as like just aesthetically of how I see how quarterbacks work, there's things he has not changed in his game, and while I don't know if I'd say it works. You could say it works for fantasy for him, but do I think he's going to be able to support McBride and Harrison at the highest levels that they're capable of? I have doubts. I think that right now they're both fantasy value, but I think that, and some of that's on Harrison, and we'll see how it grows. But I have concerns that he's not able to give guys get 100-yard games from both guys in a game, or 80 to 100 yards in a game. One guy's going to have a big game, and everybody else is going to be have crumbs. But Murray's going to get his. But it's at the expense of his offensive line. It's at the expense of his receivers running themselves ragged, and so I think I still find him a little overrated for those reasons. But I also can see your argument in the sense that, yeah, you can knock him for a lot of things, but here he is, and he is the number 7 fantasy quarterback right now in the league.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's overrated in some respects, and I think he's underrated in some respects, and it just depends on the crowd. I mean, I knew when I brought his name up you weren't going to like him because you hate guys who pull down. There are a lot of looks where he's going to pull down the ball and run with it, and it's going to just drive you nuts. That you don't abandon that play. That play's not done yet.
Or just
why are you giving up on it?
Yeah, or stretch the play out so much that again, you outrun your protection, your receivers will run ragged and all that, and then to hear him go off on DeAndre Hopkins on stuff that was clearly his deal, and those kinds of things. I just maybe again, it's bias and it's how I look at it, but just I know that he could be good, but I kind of love to hate Kyler Murray, to be honest.
And I get that, but I mean, I'm not going to say he's a better quarterback than Trevor Lawrence. In my eyes, I think they're probably at a comparable level, but I do think that Kyler Murray is a better quarterback for a bad offense than Trevor Lawrence is.
I would agree.
The Jaguars would probably be better off. Brian Thomas would not be better off with Kyler Murray under center, but I think the Jaguars would be better off with Kyler Murray under center.
I would agree.
And if the goal is to win Super Bowls, and I kind of think that this is a misguided goal. 31 out of 32 teams are not going to win a title every year. Kyler Murray probably helps you win a Super Bowl less than Trevor Lawrence does, because he's not going to take you from 8th best to 3rd best in the same way. He's not going to raise your ceiling as much. But if you have Kyler Murray under center, your offense is going to do stuff. You're never going to find yourself in a situation where Kyler Murray's in there and you're just woeful, like the Cowboys without Dak Prescott level, just ineptness, where he can make stuff happen enough on his own. And I think that's valuable too. And I get somebody who's I only care about Super Bowls, and he's probably not helping me get there as much as, one could even argue that Sam Darnold is more likely to raise you to this Super Bowl level, because he's going to work within structure. And if you have enough around him, he's going to be able to execute that, and he can keep everything humming along.
Didn't we have this conversation earlier this year?
Fran Tarkenton, yeah. This was the Fran Tarkenton.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of Fran Tarkenton, and I'm not saying that Kyler Murray is
sure.
as good as Fran Tarkenton. Tarkenton was better in structure, he was better out of structure, but that instinct to abandon structure to make something happen is very Tarkentonian. And so I like Kyler Murray. I think that buy window is probably closed. At quarterback, it's I'm looking at the quarterback list. I feel like most of the dented cans have had their dents knocked out this year. So far. There's a lot of running backs I like. I've been looking. I'm probably going to write about how to find good players on the waiver wire in dynasty leagues, and what they tend to have, and one archetype that very few waiver wire players are ever going to amount to everything. We talk about this a lot. It's very unlikely, but one archetype where it's slightly less unlikely than others is these unsexy running backs who the team likes them, right? For whatever reason, they're late round picks. They don't really have the hype coming in, but you see in their first year or two that there's some sort of institutional buy-in. And your Kyron Williamses, your Chase Brown in Cincinnati, Chuba Hubbard in Carolina. And I love those guys. One guy like that, we always talk about his running mate in Najee Harris and how people underrate what he's bringing to the table because it's not flashy and not sexy. But I like Jaylen Warren And now that Najee's having his time in the sun, I feel like people have forgotten that we used to like Jaylen Warren. Warren's the same guy he was when we liked him, a year or two ago.
Yeah.
Just because he can't unseat Najee Harris. Najee Harris is a good player. I like Tyler Algier, where again there's that institutional buy-in. Like he wasn't the hot name coming in, but we're 3 years in now. Jerome Ford in Cleveland. These guys who they stick around year after year. And I always think that's a good sign. Anytime a late drafted player makes a team as a rookie, that's unlikely, but it happens. Anytime a late drafted player continues to make the team in year 2, in year 3, that's a sign that like this organization wants to be in the business of that player. And it's like Tyler Bagent on the Bears, where he wasn't, the greatest as a rookie, but like he was the backup quarterback in back-to-back years as an undrafted player.
By that dude. By that dude. Yes.
It's really hard in one quarterback leagues, just because again, you have to be top 6 for it to matter. But like in super flex leagues, you could probably get Bagent for free, or close to free in a lot of places. And there's this show of institutional support that, so I never know.
Or
I found one quarterback.
Big IDP leagues too, where maybe you have good depth already everywhere, and you're humming along, and you just have a luxury of a roster spot. That's a guy you should add. I've done that with him in a couple of leagues.
Yeah, I'm just running down the list to try and refresh my name. That's the thing about dented-cans is the fact that they don't come to mind is kind of the whole value proposition with them.
There's a couple guys for me that might fit it, but I'm a little iffy on them. Like, I like Khalil Herbert's skills. I also like the fact that I know that the Bears don't know their head from their ass in terms of an organization right now, and haven't for quite some time. So it's not surprising that they would give up on players who might actually have some capability, or bring in players that don't fit what they do. And Herbert's a guy that was not the current administration or even the past administration's guys. They've had so much changeover that they didn't really even give him much of a chance. So I could see how, even though he's in Cincinnati right now, he could wind up somewhere else in another year or two and actually star. And because he's such a good inside runner with legitimate speed, he's just not a great receiver. So you wonder, he's one of those guys that you're maybe not expecting him to be the lead back on a multi-year contract. But he's one of those guys that you want to always keep an eye out until you find out he's broken down. Because any season, he could be inserted in and give you an 1,100, 1,200 yard season.
Yeah, I'm thinking back. It's funny, a few years ago, like Najee Harris, DeAndre Swift, and Javonte Williams were like all top 3, top 4, top 5 dynasty running backs. And at the time, I'm like, this is too early. I was kind of more in on Harris just because we saw so much from him as a rookie. But I'm like, this feels very premature. Like it seems like wish casting in a lot of respects. And then within like 2 years, they kind of underperformed, and that like dynasty owners were like, I'm done. Like it, I always say it's very emotional. Like they would rather a guy who performed poorly, but they didn't expect anything, than a guy who performed poorly, but they had very high expectations. Because the second guy, they're like, you hurt me, you're dead to me.
Yes.
Right? Like I was emotionally invested in you, and you betrayed that emotional investment, and now you're dead to me. I want nothing to do with you. And we saw Harris, we bring up every year, people are all out on him. And then like I think he has like the 3rd most 100-yard rushing games this year. Like he did 3 straight. He and Mixon are the only guys with 3 straight 100-yard rushing games. And DeAndre Swift, like everybody was done with him. They were done with him heading into last year in Philly, and he's like a surprise top 20 guy. They're done with him this year in Chicago, and he's like a surprise top 20 guy. And like, at what point do we stop being surprised that DeAndre Swift, whose skill set is very tailored to PPR fantasy production, winds up producing in PPR fantasy leagues? And then I would add the 3rd member of that trio to the dented-can list in Javonte Williams, where he was never as good as people wanted him to be. And it's hard. I wrote an article a few years back about like, we think that we measure what we value, but in turn, we wind up valuing what we measure. And I think one of the easiest aspects of running back play that's to quantify would be breaking tackles. As long as you want a superficial quantification, and you're going to go into the, I know you're going to jump in and be like, well, a broken tackle isn't a broken tackle.
I've already done it enough. We don't need to.
Yeah,
we're good.
I'm there with you on that. But just in terms of like broken tackles per play, through whatever data source you're getting it from, that is stable from year to year. That is sticky from year to year. It is a good thing to be able to break tackles, all else being equal. You'd rather more tackle breaking ability than less. And Javonte Williams, like, that's his hallmark, is he's a tackle breaker. And so he kind of got steamed up where, like, oh, this is the only thing about running back play that we can measure, and he's great at it. So therefore, we're going to value him really high. And it's not like, that's not, it turns out, surprisingly, the be-all, end-all to playing the running back position is just breaking tackles. But, he's an unrestricted free agent after this year. And I do think that some team's going to give him a shot, and I would not be at all surprised if he winds up being like a DeAndre Swift, where, like, we completely write him off, and he lands in new circumstances with kind of maybe like a muddy path to relevance. But he plays pretty well because he's not a bad running back, and he kind of earns a larger share of the pie than we were thinking, and he's a surprise top 20, top 15 guy a year from now.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I mean, for me, I would probably say another guy at running back, and I don't know if I want to put him as a dented can, but then again, last year, people looked at Joe Mixon as like on the way down. And he was RB6 last year, and the perception was worse than what his actual production was.
Because he's inefficient.
He's inefficient. Well, a player to me who is RB21 right now is Ramondre Stevenson, and he can do it all. He's just with a rookie quarterback on a bad offense, and if they can start to add a little bit to that and make a difference, the talent's still there. He's a tackle breaker. He is absolutely someone that can make you miss, and he's worked at his craft. Because, first of all, when they were still a decent team, or considered a decent team, he had to prove himself with the coaching staff that he was willing to work and do what he had to do. When he came out of JUCO, he was like a 2,000-yard JUCO runner, but he weighed 250 pounds. I mean, and by the time his second year as a Patriot was there, he's lost, like, before even his second year, he had lost like 15, 20 pounds and rebuilt his body, and he continued to do so. So this is someone who's really worked at the craft of being a top-end athlete, or maximizing his athletic skills, in addition to retaining a lot of the qualities that he had and adding more to it. So maybe this isn't the environment that's best for him, but the fact that he's on that craptastic offense and he is RB21 is a dented can to me.
Yeah. Whenever somebody mentions Ramondre Stevenson, I always think of Josh Jacobs, just because that was like the big debate last year where everybody's like, oh, Ramondre Stevenson over Jacobs. And I'm like, why? They're the same age. The Jacobs has always been the more productive of the two. And then, it would get into the whole mileage debate, which mileage, as we've discussed, is kind of pseudoscience, that, like, it doesn't matter that Jacobs had more career carries. The fact that he had more career carries, if anything, is a positive sign.
Yep.
And so, I see Ramondre Stevenson, and I'm always like, but who else is doing good?
Right.
Josh Jacobs.
Absolutely.
But you are absolutely right that Stevenson, I think, is a better receiver than Jacobs, and he's a good back in his own right. And he kind of got, like Williams and Swift and Harris, he kind of got steamed up a little prematurely, but just because he didn't live up to your unrealistic expectations for him, that doesn't make him a bad running back. He's still a useful, and that's kind of the thing at the running back position. It's, people want a back who's a star, and there's very, very few of those.
Yeah.
Just shockingly few of those. Really, you just want a back who's useful, because if you have a back who's useful, teams are going to use him. Tony Pollard, we saw that same thing. Tony Pollard was a classic dented can, where he was very useful behind Elliott, and then people are like, oh, he's quote unquote efficient. I'm always going to do air quotes whenever I talk about running back efficiency. He was efficient, and they're like, oh, he's a star. And he came out and he underwhelmed, and he, I think he was still a top 20 running back last year, but he hurt people, and so he's dead to them, and he's completely written off. And now he's in Tennessee, where they're like, hey, you can be useful to us, and he's producing again. It's after he was completely written off. I'm trying to think how many running backs in the league right now are legit stars. 5, maybe 10.
Yeah.
And then after that, it's a bunch of running backs with skills that can fit roles. And if they can fill a role, they'll get the workload. And if they get the workload, they're going to produce.
David Montgomery would top that list. Kareem Hunt's
Absolutely.
even better. Yeah.
Kareem Hunt, like the guy's out of the NFL, right? You look at age.
Browns didn't want him. Yeah.
Right? And now he's been, since he signed with Kansas City, he's probably been like a top 12 fantasy running back.
Yeah.
Because he was useful. They had a need, and Kareem Hunt could do the things that they needed from the position, and they put him on the field, and he produces.
Yeah.
And so that's always what I'm looking for at running back. It's not, is he a star? I don't think Ramondre Stevenson's going to be a star. I don't think Jalen Warren's going to be a star. But Javonte Williams is not the star that we made him out to be. But these are guys who can do useful things, and if things break well, they will find a team that wants the useful things that they can do.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Well, on that end, let's go ahead and call it. Again, you can find Adam Harstad at Adam Harstad on X. Find me at Matt Waldman on X. Of course, at footballguys.com. Check out his article on age and the treatment of that, Dynasty in Theory. And you can find also the regression work that he does and the work on kickers and the variety of things that are available there at footballguys.com. You can check us out there, and we appreciate you, and we've appreciated the feedback on the variety of podcasts that we've done in the past couple of weeks that veered away from the normal spectrum of things. So I'm glad that you guys enjoyed that as well, and we'll see you next week.